There is a moment often overlooked where the quiet hum of unease that lingers beneath the surface of our daily lives begins to sharpen, to rise, and to take form. An ache in the chest, a racing thought, a sleepless night, a sense that something is not quite right. And yet when we turn inward to locate the source of this discomfort, we often find nothing concrete, nothing specific to point to, only a vague and persistent sensation that we have come to call anxiety. And we are taught almost immediately to treat this as a problem, a flaw, a malfunction in the machinery of our psyche, something to be silenced, medicated, ignored, or eradicated. But what if the problem is not the feeling itself, but the framework in which we interpret it? What if, as Alan Watts suggested with his piercing insight into the nature of human consciousness, this state of inner turmoil is not a disorder, but a signal, not an error, but a kind of awakening, an involuntary confrontation with a truth that we have spent much of our lives attempting to avoid? "You're not anxious," Watts might have said with a half-smile and a twinkle in his eye. "You're awake. Awake not in the mystical, esoteric sense that populates spiritual platitudes, but in the raw, difficult, uncompromising sense of being fully alive in a world that is constantly shifting beneath your feet, in a universe where certainty is an illusion, control is a myth, and the very ground of your identity is, at its core, impermanent and undefined." Anxiety, in this light, is not evidence of weakness or brokenness, but the natural consequence of seeing clearly, of recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that the structures we rely on for meaning, security, and self-definition are all, without exception, temporary, fragile, and constructed atop the endless current of change that defines the human experience. For most of us, the illusion of stability is not simply a comfort, it is a necessity. We build routines, identities, and relationships as fortresses against the chaos that lies just beyond the borders of our control. And we believe, or pretend to believe, that with enough effort, enough planning, enough discipline or faith or affirmation, we can bend the world to our will and forge a life immune to disorder. But the deeper truth, the one that anxiety tries to whisper in our quiet moments, is that none of these fortresses can protect us from the truth of impermanence, that the job can be lost, the loved one can leave, the body can fail, the world can shift overnight. And when our minds begin to register this not as a distant possibility, but as an ever-present reality, the panic we feel is not irrational, but entirely appropriate to the condition of being human. Alan Watts, in his work, The Wisdom of Insecurity, laid bare this paradox in language as beautiful as it is devastating, that the very search for security is what creates insecurity, that the more tightly we grip at life in an effort to control it, the more it slips through our fingers, and that true peace, true presence, is found not in mastery but in surrender. He observed that modern people, in their relentless drive toward progress and self-improvement, have forgotten how to live. They are so fixated on the next milestone, the next goal, the next version of themselves, that they never actually inhabit the moment they are in. And this constant mental projection into the future leaves them hollowed out, disconnected from the only thing that truly exists, the now. And this is the crucible of our modern anxiety. Not simply that we face stress, or uncertainty or change, but that we are trying to navigate these experiences while disconnected from ourselves, from our breath, from the body, from the present moment, always seeking, always striving, always afraid. In truth, the experience we call anxiety is, more often than not, the soul's protest against unconscious living. It is the friction created when our outer life moves forward in pursuit of performance, image, and approval, while our inner truth remains unspoken, unfelt, and unseen. It is the symptom of a deeper dissonance, a rupture between the constructed self, the one we show to the world, and the authentic self that longs to simply be. Watts challenged us to stop pathologizing this inner tension, and instead to listen to it, to sit with it, to understand that what we interpret as panic may in fact be presence misunderstood, a byproduct of awakening not yet integrated, the heat of a mind beginning to crack open to something larger than its habitual narratives. When you start to wake up, truly wake up, to the nature of reality, it is not gentle or comforting. It is, in many ways, terrifying. Because to wake up is to see clearly, and to see clearly is to realize that there are no guarantees that everything you love can be taken, that nothing stays the same, and that you are not who you thought you were, not fixed, not static, not safe in the way your ego once believed. To wake up is to feel the raw edges of existence without the anesthetic of certainty, to recognize that the world is not something to be tamed or solved, but something to be met with humility, reverence, and curiosity. And so anxiety is not the enemy of awareness. It is often its first companion. It is the pulse of the soul, shaking off illusion, the cry of consciousness breaking through denial, the sound of the psyche refusing to live another day behind a mask that no longer fits. But because we have been taught to fear discomfort, to silence it, to fix it, we miss the invitation embedded within it, the call to slow down, to come home to ourselves, to examine the life we're living, and ask honestly and without judgment if it aligns with who we really are. This is the sacred potential of anxiety, not that it goes away, but that it transforms, that in choosing to stay present with it, without resistance, without self-blame, we allow it to show us where we are out of alignment, where we are living from fear instead of truth, where we have abandoned our own center in pursuit of something that was never real to begin with. And yet, this shift cannot happen intellectually. It cannot be willed or forced or theorized into existence. As Watts often reminded us, insight is not a product of effort, but of surrender. The moment you try to grasp it, it slips away, like water through your hands. To heal your anxiety is not to eliminate it, but to understand it, to befriend it, to let it soften in the warm gaze of your own attention, to realize that the racing heart, the sweaty palms, the restlessness, the insomnia, these are not signs that you are broken, but that you are finally beginning to feel what has long been avoided. And this is not a failure, it is a beginning. Watts taught that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And in this light, anxiety ceases to be a sign of weakness and becomes instead a spiritual threshold, a crossing point between unconscious repetition and conscious existence, between numbness and aliveness, between pretending and being. To walk through that threshold is to become intimate with the full spectrum of your experience, to allow joy and sorrow, confidence and doubt, clarity and confusion to all have their place without needing to fix or eliminate any of them. It is to recognize that awakening is not a one-time event, but a continuous process of becoming ever more honest, ever more open, ever more aligned with the reality that is unfolding in each breath. You are not anxious, Watts would remind us again. You are awake. And to be awake is to feel everything, not just the beautiful parts, but the grief, the fear, the longing, the uncertainty, and to feel it without turning away. This is the paradox. The more you allow yourself to feel, the more capacity you develop to be with whatever arises, and the less power anxiety holds over you, not because you have defeated it, but because you have stopped fearing it. When you no longer interpret your discomfort as a failure, when you stop believing that your vulnerability is a flaw, you create space for a deeper peace, not the peace of control, but the peace of alignment, of authenticity, of resting in the truth of your own being. And so, perhaps, the next time that wave of unease rises in your chest, you will not rush to distract or numb or analyze it away. Perhaps you will pause, place a gentle hand on your heart, and say to yourself with quiet courage, "This is not wrong. This is not a sign that I am broken. This is what it feels like to be alive. This is what it means to wake up." And in that moment, something begins to shift. Not the anxiety itself, but your relationship to it. And from that shift, a new path opens, not one of avoidance, but of presence, not one of control, but of connection. You are not anxious, you are awakening, and that is no small thing. It is the beginning of everything. And yet, the journey does not end with this realization. For to awaken, as Alan Watts often implied through his playful yet penetrating teachings, is not a one-time revelation that grants eternal peace or an elevated state that shields us from future suffering, but rather the beginning of a more conscious participation in the very dance of existence we once tried to choreograph. A kind of open-eyed engagement with life that refuses to deny its uncertainty, refuses to simplify its paradoxes, and dares to remain present even when the ground beneath our feet begins to tremble again. Because make no mistake, the trembling will return, not as punishment or regression, but as a natural part of what it means to be a sensitive and awake human being in a world that is often bewildering, sometimes brutal and always in flux, a world where joy and pain coexist, where beauty is fleeting and truth is often obscured, and where to feel deeply is not a liability, but a mark of profound participation in the mystery of being alive. And this perhaps is the deeper teaching that Watts tried to communicate, not just through his words, but through his tone, his laughter, his willingness to be both philosopher and fool, that we are not meant to conquer life with our intellects, nor to retreat from it in fear, but to meet it as it is, in its full unpredictability, without clinging to ideals or recoiling from discomfort, to embrace the wildness of the human experience as a necessary, even sacred terrain through which our souls are shaped. For when we finally stop resisting the discomfort that so often arrives in the guise of anxiety, when we stop labeling it as a defect to be fixed or a threat to be subdued, we begin to uncover the deeper intelligence that lives within it, the quiet voice beneath the chaos that is asking not for suppression, but for listening, not for perfection, but for presence, and not for escape, but for embodiment. And so, paradoxically, the path out of anxiety is not away from it, but through it. Not by force, not by strategy, but by surrendering to the very moment we are in, no matter how uncomfortable or uncertain it may feel, and recognizing that this very moment, raw and unfiltered, is the only doorway into the kind of peace that is not based on circumstance, but on alignment with truth. Because what Watts was pointing to all along is that the true source of our suffering is not reality itself, but our refusal to accept it as it is. Not the experience of fear, but our belief that fear is something we should not feel. Not the chaos of the world, but our demand that the world behave according to our expectations. And that once we release these conditions, once we let go of our insistence that life be tidy, understandable, and manageable, we open ourselves to a kind of spaciousness that cannot be found through control, only through surrender. This is why in moments of deep anxiety, the most transformative thing we can do is not to run from our bodies or distract our minds, but to drop into the sensation itself, to feel the tightening of the chest, the quickening of the breath, the flood of energy moving through the nervous system, and instead of interpreting it as a malfunction, to experience it as a signal that something within us is waking up, something that wants our attention, our compassion, our willingness to stay with what is, instead of reaching for what was or fantasizing about what could be. And if we can learn to do this, not perfectly, not always, but even occasionally, we begin to understand that anxiety, when met with awareness, becomes aliveness. That panic, when held in love, becomes presence. That fear, when walked through instead of avoided, becomes a path toward a more intimate relationship with ourselves and the world around us. Alan Watts knew this deeply, which is why his philosophy was never about escaping the world through spiritual bypassing or numbing oneself with comforting illusions, but about entering more fully into the chaos, into the paradox, into the mystery, with a spirit of curiosity and even playfulness, knowing that what we call awakening is not about arriving at a fixed state, but about opening ourselves again and again to the flow of life that cannot be predicted or controlled. So when the anxiety returns, as it surely will, when the mind races, the chest tightens, the old doubts and fears begin to whisper once again, you might remember these words not as a cure, but as a reminder that what you are feeling is not necessarily a step backward, not a sign that something is wrong, but perhaps the next layer of illusion unraveling, the next layer of self-protection peeling away, the next invitation to live. More honestly, more presently, more deeply than you have before. Because to be truly awake is not to be immune to pain or free from doubt. It is to feel all of it and still choose to stay. It is to know the mind's games and not be fooled. It is to witness the tides of emotion rise and fall without needing to build a dam or construct a narrative to explain them. It is to meet each moment, however it arrives, with the same open-hearted curiosity that Watts brought to his inquiry, into the nature of self and the structure of reality, asking not, how do I make this go away, but what is this moment trying to show me about who I am, what I fear, what I've forgotten, and what I am being called to remember. And when you begin to live in this way, when anxiety ceases to be a threat and becomes instead a signal, a messenger, a doorway, you will find that what once overwhelmed you begins to soften, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You have become more spacious, more grounded, more rooted in the awareness that you are not the storm, but the sky it moves through. You have stopped seeking safety in outcomes and started finding it in presence. You have stopped chasing peace as a destination and started discovering it in the very act of showing up for your life, moment by moment, breath by breath. And so, let these words not be a destination but a practice, a lens through which to see your experience anew, not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be lived. You are not anxious, you are awake. And that, though it may feel overwhelming at times, is the beginning of freedom. Because once you begin to see your anxiety not as a malfunction or a disease of the modern soul, but as the raw, unfiltered energy of consciousness, becoming more aware of itself, you start to understand that what you called anxiety may have simply been the side effect of clarity piercing through the dense fog of distraction, denial, and false security in which you had unconsciously taken refuge. And this is where the teachings of Alan Watts become not just poetic or provocative, but profoundly practical. For when he speaks of the self as an illusion, when he challenges the division between the observer and the observed, between the thinker and the thought, what he is really pointing us toward is the possibility of a life in which we no longer relate to our experiences from a place of distance or judgment, but from an intimacy so immediate, so total, that there is no longer anyone left to resist the moment as it unfolds. This intimacy, with life, with emotion, with breath, with the very texture of being, is not something you attain through effort or discipline or spiritual achievement. Rather, it is something that arises naturally the moment you stop trying to hold yourself separate from what is happening, the moment you surrender the illusion that there is a you apart from the anxiety, apart from the fear, apart from the tension and the tightness and the unease that surges through you like an electric current calling you back to the present. And this, paradoxically, is the essence of awakening. Not a disembodied transcendence, but a deeper embodiment. Not an escape from pain, but a turning toward it with such honesty and openness that the pain begins to reveal its hidden layers, its buried messages, its strangely luminous wisdom. Because beneath every anxious thought is a wound that has not been witnessed, a truth that has not been spoken, a fear that has not been embraced. And when we meet these things with kindness instead of criticism, with curiosity instead of control, we begin to dissolve the very structures of self-deception that kept us trapped in cycles of suffering for so long. And that is why, in the stillness beneath your panic, there is a kind of invitation being extended to you, not by some external force or cosmic power, but by your own soul, by the deepest part of you that remembers what it means to be whole, what it means to trust the rhythm of your breath, what it means to stand in the fire of feeling and not be consumed but transformed. This is the awakening that Watts alluded to again and again, not a rejection of the world, but a return to it. Not a retreat into the abstract, but a radical presence with the concrete reality of your body, your mind, your emotions, your relationships, and the endlessly unfolding miracle of being alive. Because once you stop trying to fix yourself, once you stop believing that you are broken simply because you feel deeply, you begin to realize that your sensitivity is not a flaw, but a faculty, that your discomfort is not a failure but a kind of compass, pointing you toward the places within you that are ready to be reclaimed, reintegrated, and re-inhabited with love. And this reclamation, this integration, this slow and patient unfolding of your inner life is what awakening truly looks like. Not a lightning bolt of enlightenment that erases all your problems, but a quiet, persistent willingness to be with yourself exactly as you are, to stop abandoning yourself when things get hard, and to realize that what you once called anxiety was, in many ways, your soul's way of shaking you awake. Because the truth is, many people live their entire lives asleep, numb to their own pain, disconnected from their own joy, sleepwalking through their days in pursuit of things they don't truly want, and identities they never chose. But you, if you are anxious, if you are restless, if you are unsettled, are not asleep. You are beginning to wake up. And though that awakening may come with trembling and tears, with confusion and chaos, it is also laced with moments of exquisite clarity, with sudden glimpses of grace, with the realization that even your darkest hours were never a detour, but a necessary part of your path. Because just as dawn often feels cold and uncertain before the sun fully rises, so too does awakening often begin with discomfort, with the painful awareness of how long you've been living in denial, how many parts of yourself you've abandoned in the name of fitting in, how many truths you've swallowed to avoid making. Waves. But now the tide is turning, now the light is returning, now you are beginning to see that your anxiety was never your enemy, but your own inner wisdom dressed in uncomfortable clothing, demanding to be heard, refusing to let you go back to sleep. And if you can listen, if you can stay, if you can breathe, if you can hold yourself through it without needing to understand it all at once, you will find that beneath the storm, there is a stillness that has never been disturbed, a presence that has always been with you, a part of you that knew, even when your mind didn't, that something more honest, more alive, more real was possible. So let yourself feel what you feel. Let the waves rise and crash. Let the questions come without needing to answer them, and above all, let yourself remember that awakening is not an arrival, but a deepening into yourself, into life, into the present moment, again and again. You're not anxious, you're awake, and that is a beautiful, terrifying, necessary thing.